Nobody's perfect, and I'm not here to say that the blue zones are perfect, and I'm not here to say that the blue zones are doing it all right. And what I'm definitely not saying is that everything the blue zones do, we need to do. But what we do have to look at is a little bit of a different awareness of what the blue zones bring. Now, we know there's issues with the reporting. We know there's issues with the record keeping. It is what it is. But one thing that we can take from the blue zones is that no matter what, they do have large concentrations of centenarians. But rather than saying, hey, what do they all do? Why don't we look at the specific foods that each blue zone eats and what makes each blue zone unique? Now, I've kind of done a similar video with this before, but it was very in-depth and very scientific. In this case, I just want to take a few key foods that each region eats, and then maybe you could craft your own longevity diet based on what we see from each given region that has very unique foods in each respective region. Let's go ahead and just jump right in. The first one, probably the most popular one that people know, is Okinawa. Now, Okinawa as a blue zone is also the one that comes under fire the most when it comes down to the reporting, because the record keeping isn't really great, and nowadays they're not living as long as they used to, but there's still a lot of interesting things that came from that. For one, the Okinawans eat a lot of sweet potatoes, a whole lot of purple sweet potatoes. And the interesting thing is that when you look at the Okinawans compared to the other blue zones, they are really eating a significantly larger amount of sweet potatoes compared to other blue zones. So that could be one of the things that makes them interesting. Obviously, the anthocyanins, the beta-carotenes, the different flavonoids that are in these sweet potatoes might just be a really powerful longevity food. They also eat a lot of fermented food. They even eat like pickled meat, like pickled pig's feet, things like a lot of fermented food in Okinawa compared to the other blue zones. Now, with that, there's also a good degree of like fermented soy, right? So if you look in the United States, like soy might be questionable for a lot of people. But when you look at Japan, like soy seems to be actually quite good. And you look at Okinawa and fermented soy, natto, you've got nattokinase in it, you've got these things that are hugely beneficial. Now, the biggest thing that we see with Okinawa is their claim to fame is going to be that they live in a caloric deficit. They're in a significant deficit. Usually that's kind of been estimated about 15 to 20% deficit yearly. That's a significant amount of like imbalance, right, between energy in and energy out. So maybe we do learn that from them. Now, they also eat a lot of sea plants. So they eat kelp. So they're getting a good amount of iodine, a good amount of these minerals that when you look at other regions of the world, they're just not getting the same of. And you look at the other blue zones, they're not really eating kelp. They're not getting those kind of like sea bubbles or whatever that particular plant is, that kind of thing they eat. I don't know if it's called sea bubbles, but it's like a bubbly kind of plant that's grown in the ocean. Point is there's unique foods to Okinawa. So what could you take away? Probably more fermented, more deficit, and more sweet potatoes. Now let's jump over to Greece, a specific region of Greece, Ikaria, Greece. Ikaria, potato, I suppose. But what makes it unique there? Like, what are they doing that's different from other blue zones? Well, one thing that's not necessarily different, but is definitely a big deal there, lots of legumes. So a huge amount of legume consumption. So we are probably looking at a good amount of fiber. We are probably looking at a good amount of just micronutrition there. But I don't think that that's the unique thing. Maybe the legumes keep us that they eat less other stuff, but they also consume a lot of goat dairy. So a lot of goat milk. Their primary dairy is goat dairy, which is going to be more of an A2 type milk anyway. It's going to be a lower beta casomorphin protein, so it's potentially healthier in that respect, and it's probably going to be raw. So you're not going through this pasteurization effect where you're impacting it. We are pretty well designed to probably handle it in that form, so they consume a lot of that. One of the other things that's very interesting is they consume a lot of in-season food. So this particular region of Greece, they're very big on eating foods that are in season. I can't remember the name of the one soup. It's just coming to mind right now. But they even have a soup that's literally their summer soup versus their winter soup. And they call it as such. And the point is that we probably should be eating what's in season. So that probably plays a pretty big role too. Now, out of all the blue zones, they do seem to eat the most amount of fish. So there's a lot of fish that they consume there, a lot of smaller fatty fish, so you're getting a good amount of omega-3s, which is quite interesting, of course. But then the other piece that I found really interesting is they consume a high amount of sage and dandelion tea. These are unique kinds of herbs, particularly sage, because sage has been in a couple of studies that I've looked at where they're looking at the Mediterranean diet, Mediterranean spices, and these things like rosemary and thyme and sage, these have impacts on our cells when it comes down to fat adaptation and fat utilization. Now, this is in a small amount when cooked with food. Now, you take a concentrated amount with tea and it's kind of interesting. So again, I'm not saying all these things are perfect, but we're kind of highlighting these different attributes of the blue zones to see, like, what foods could I integrate in? Would it be pretty easy for you to integrate goat milk in? Yeah. Would it be pretty easy for you to integrate in-season fruits? Yeah, probably. It would also probably be pretty easy for you to integrate sage or dandelion tea, to be quite frank. Now let's move into the next blue zone, which is one of my favorite blue zones, just because, I don't know, I just like the area anyway, Sardinia. Now, Sardinia is particularly unique because they have some foods that are almost solely specific there. There is a lot of sheep milk. Sheep milk is slightly different from goat milk. Protein content is different, fat profile is slightly different, and then they eat particular cheeses. The one cheese I've talked about before is pecorino, various forms of pecorino, pecorino romano, and then these are cheeses that are made from sheep milk and then they are aged, so they become much more microbially active, but they also sort of go through their own pre-stage of digestion before you're ever consuming it. The fat profile of these cheeses, of sheep milk, and particularly the cheeses when it's kind of cultured more, is very unique. And we're seeing evidence now that some of the saturated fats that are in these sheep cheeses could be hugely productive when it comes down to longevity research and actually providing structural stability for the cell and protection from things like ferroptosis, which is sort of like an iron buildup that affects oxidative stress and affects the cell. So huge things there where we're saying, like, wait a minute, this could be one of the common denominators within the Sardinian region as to why they live so long, independent of their great lifestyle, their relationships and whatnot. I also put a link down below for a company called Fatty 15, which has isolated that same fat that is in the sheep's cheese, that pecorino cheese. It's called C15. They've isolated it into a more concentrated form so that vegans can get it, so that anyone can get it and kind of get that C15, because there was recently a paper published, I think back in July of 2024, and this demonstrated that C15 fats are one of the first clinical, if not the first clinical deficiency in 75 years. We're recognizing that humans are deficient in this fat because we do not get enough good quality dairy fat. Now, full disclosure, you can definitely just eat more dairy fat, good quality dairy fat. Always recommend eating a whole food diet, but I also think that supplements have a play. So I put a link down below. That is a code for 15% off, and using that link in the top line of the description. The company is called Fatty 15. They've done this with a lot of Navy research. So they've had Navy funding to kind of research this and understand these clinical deficiencies that we're seeing in C15. So it's quite interesting. So that link is down below. Another thing the Sardinians consume is they consume mastic oil. Mastic oil comes from the mastic tree, and it's a particularly stable oil that seems to have huge cardiovascular disease protective effects. So cardioprotective, metabolically protective, and it's pretty rare to get other than in Sardinia. But you can go on Amazon, you can go places and get mastic oil, and it's relatively stable. Just get it in a dark bottle. So again, and they also drink certain kinds of wine. I can't remember the name of it right offhand. I'd forgotten about it when I was formulating this video, but it's a wine that is grown at somewhat higher altitude, so it's a higher antioxidant content. But we'll kind of come back to that in a little bit. Now I want to jump over to Costa Rica, which is my favorite blue zone. It's the Nicoyan Peninsula. And if you think like good quality, really good quality huevos rancheros, that's like their diet, right? I shouldn't say that. They don't just eat huevos rancheros, but they're eating a lot of fruit. They're eating a lot of locally raised chicken, a lot of eggs, a lot of beans, a lot of fermented maize, like corn. I mean, that sounds like huevos rancheros to me. Maybe just need some cheese or something, right? And I don't know their cheese intake. Point is they are one of the regions in the blue zones that actually consumes probably more protein than the other regions. Okay, so when you look at the other regions, Sardinia and Greece, and yeah, I mean, they consume protein for sure. They're definitely not getting it. But when you look at the Nicoyan Peninsula, their chicken intake and their egg intake isn't ridiculously high, but certainly higher than the other blue zones. They also eat a fair bit of sugar from fruit because they're eating more tropical fruits, and they're eating peach palm, which is pretty darn sweet. But they're also getting a lot of polyphenols and antioxidants from those fruits. Now, the common denominator amongst all of these blue zones is, yes, lots of deep leafy greens, lots of vegetables, but I didn't want to focus on the common denominators. I wanted to focus on these outliers and these interesting foods. But of course, the beans are a big thing, right? Lots of beans, lots of that. So you're getting a lot of fiber, but you're also getting, once again, even though it's plant-based, you're getting a lot of protein. So you got protein from the eggs, protein from the chicken, protein from the beans. You got good quality fruit. Sounds like kind of a fun diet, and tropical fruits that are sweet too, and a little less in the way of berries. So maybe papaya and things like that. So again, quite the contrast from Okinawa. So it would be kind of just disingenuous to say that the common, most important thing is vegetables amongst all these when you're looking at like, well, the diets are wildly different. We should look at what makes them unique, not just the common denominators here. The last one we have to look at is very interesting, and it tells us a lot. It's Loma Linda. Now, Loma Linda is a little bit more unique because they're lacto-ovo-vegetarians. There's no meat consumption. There is some dairy and some eggs, but not that much. So again, you're looking lots of veggies here in Loma Linda. You're looking lots of fruits, you're looking beans. So it's a pretty low protein diet, yet they live long. But what I find particularly interesting about Loma Linda is because it's an Adventist community, they do not drink or they do not smoke. The other blue zones do allow drinking and smoking. There's nothing outlawing it. And there's a moderate amount of it, particularly in like Sardinia, where they actually consume a fair bit. But in Loma Linda, their diet is a little less diverse. It's definitely more plant focused. But I think, in my personal humble opinion, what makes the biggest dent for Loma Linda is the fact that they have less alcohol or no alcohol consumption and no smoking. So it's like, hey, you take a community of people and no one drinks, and what do you know? You have a large concentration of centenarians. So with all this takeaway, it's like we've got sweet potatoes, we've got good goat milk, we've got fish, we've got sheep cheese, pecorino romano, we've got unique mastic oil, good oils, we've got good fruit, we've got chicken, we've got beans, we've got maize, like fermented maize, corn, and we have no alcohol and no smoking. That, no particular region eats just like that, right? That's a collective total of all the blue zones, the longevity zones, and putting it into something that could work. And then you combine that with what we know with Western medicine and what we know here, pretty awesome. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.